Hello everyone, welcome back to a new video. And I recently posted my sketchbook tour and I've gotten a lot of positive response from it. I've gotten a lot of sweet messages from you. Oh my goodness. I've gotten a lot of sweet messages from you guys saying that you liked my sketchbook, and that makes me so happy. But a reoccurring question I've gotten on my sketchbook tour and my previous one is, I want to know how you color with alcohol markers. They look so good. And I say, really? I mean, there's better out there than me, but if you want me to share how I color, I will gladly do so, my dearest viewer. Here you go. Insert my How I Color with Alcohol Markers video. I feel the need to preface. I am not a professional in any way, shape, or form. This is just how I, a self-taught marker user, has learned to color with alcohol markers. Specifically, Ohuhu. I have never tried other brands such as Copic. So, take my advice with a grain of salt, and if this tutorial does not apply to you, don't feel like you have to watch it. First part of how I color is the skin. Because the skin is the base of the character, I often start with it first. So, when I am coloring the skin, I often will think about how the lighting is and what the light source is. For those unfamiliar with the term light source, essentially, how is the light hitting your character? Is the light hitting your character from the left, from the right? Is light coming from behind, from straight on, over top, underneath? You have to think about this before you start coloring willy-nilly. For this example, I chose to have a strong light source coming from the left of Link's face, with a stronger shadow on the right of his face. First thing I did was add the highlights to the side of his face, and then after I added highlights, I am going in with the base skin tone of my character. After I add in the flat skin tone, I would then add my basic harsh shadows and blush. I usually do add blush to my characters, but in this instance, I forgot, so don't be mad at me, but you will just see me here adding my first pass of hard shadows without any blending. This is where I add in, again, keeping my light source in mind. This is a harsh shadow, so the direct right side of Link will have much more dramatic lighting than the left where the light is hitting his face. And for adding shading to my character, I like adding gradients of both blue and purple. Blue and purple shadows are really good to add to your pieces. Because if you look at shadows in real life, the shadow will usually have a bluish tint to it. I did not make this up. This is something artists have been using for years. So yeah, add blue and purple shadows to your character and blend it and make a gradient. I do this myself, starting with a passive purple and then over top the purple, adding more details of blue like you see me doing here. After that, I add shadows to my eyes, because adding a drop shadow to your eye can add a lot to your character, because if your eyes are left stark white, it's kind of jarring. And yeah, that's essentially how I go about shading the skin. Next is hair. First thing I do is I take the base skin tone and I add it along the areas that are closest to the face. I do this because it helps the hair and the face look more cohesive together and not so jarring like a cut between the hair and the head. It looks more like soft. After I add the skin tone around the face, I add the band of highlight on the head just to know where the lighting is going to be, where his highlights are, etc. To make sure the theme of lighting was consistent with his skin and his hair, I added the highlight to be much more prominent on his left side. After that, I take the base color of the hair and I add coloring. As you can see, I usually I make it more wobbly around the highlight area so that the highlights look more jagged and not quite so smooth. But if that goes with your art style and your highlights look more like a band than jagged, you could go ahead and do that. I prefer my lighting to look a little bit more jagged. And I feel like a lot of people will tend to use a lot of colors when coloring their hair and their characters, but I think people don't realize how far your coloring can go simply just by layering your markers. Alcohol markers dry rather quickly, so simply just layering the same color over and over top of itself several times can give you a good solid look. And I also feel like it makes it look more smooth and nice. Another thing to keep in mind about highlighting the hair is that I like to add a direct shadow underneath the direct highlights. Adding a lot of contrast to your hair especially can make it look more visually appealing, interesting, and overall nice to look at, versus if everything was soft blending, it does not have the same appeal, and it looks very static compared to where if you have lighting with lots of contrast, that'll make your drawings and marker art look a lot better. After I do the basic shading with my main color, I go in with a darker color for the hair to really further the shadows on especially the right side of his hair, which is darker in comparison to the left side. Usually after that, I do tend to add a little bit more shading myself using those same purple and blue colors. You know, because purple and blue are just goated for shading. Literally, it will make anything look so much better. Oh, and one thing I should mention about shading skin that I forgot to mention before is the lighter the skin tone, the more prominent the shadows. But the darker the skin tone, the more prominent the highlights. So since I'm working with a character with a lighter skin tone and blonde hair, I am adding a lot of contrast because that is really what's going to make this pop. Hence me adding the harsh shadows and intense lighting. Next, I am coloring the green leaves on Link. Because I went for kind of a abstract look with this piece, or not very logical, I thought might as well just throw leaves all over Link, because why not? I added vines all over him, and to color it, I go underneath all the leaves with a yellow color, then over top with a green color, and I leave the parts yellow that I want highlighted. Then I go in with a even darker shade of green to add the more prominent shadows of the leaves, where it's bending, and to further emphasize the lighting of the situation. Really take advantage of shading, and once again I added a lot more blue to the leaves as well. Because leaves are rather thin, I left the middle of the leaves fairly light because leaves are very thin, so when the light shines through it, the leaves have almost a transparent look to them. So I wanted to emulate that. Next, I am adding the coloring to his name behind him. I am doing a simple gradient for this piece where I went with a yellow, then with the lighter green, and then with the darker green. I achieved this gradient look simply by flicking the marker. It's not totally smooth, but just because they're thinner and they're not super visible, it gets the look achievement across. Next, I am coloring in the flowers. Right now I'm adding the yellow, which serves as the highlights of the flower. After I add the yellow highlights, I am going in with the base color of the flower, which is pink. Because pink flowers in Link's hair? Heck yes, I will do that any day. This was just a very self-indulgent drawing, if you couldn't tell. But after I added the light pink, I went in with a darker pink to add the shadows to all the petals and further emphasize the depth of the flowers. I feel like these flowers didn't turn out the best, but you know, I was kind of not trying with the flowers. I don't know, I need to practice flowers more. After I add the deeper shadows to the flowers, I'm going in for a second pass with the colors because like I said, layering colors on top of each other can go a long way with shading. You don't necessarily need to layer different colors on top of each other. Just simply layering the same color over and over can give you a darker, more saturated look. And for the sake of adding some more color variety to the flowers, I did throw in little pieces of blue in there. Again, purple and blue shading can just work in any scenario, in my opinion. It goes so hard. And in the case of the flowers, it didn't really make much sense, but I feel like that added blue gave the color contrast that they kind of needed because they weren't looking too hot, so they just needed that little extra spice. And moving on to clothing. How do I color clothing? Essentially, I lay down the highlights. This case, I decided to go with yellow highlights, even though now that I think about it, I probably would have used just a lighter, more saturated blue. I don't think the yellow looked the best in this scenario, but you know, it's fine. I then went over it with my base clothing color. I gave him a blue shirt to somewhat reminisce or resemble his blue tunic in Breath of the Wild, which ignore the fact that the clothing style is definitely not that tunic, but still, Blue and Link have just become so iconic ever since that game. After adding down the base color, I add the basic clothing folds of the shirt, usually with a more saturated blue, because layering a lighter color on top of a darker color with alcohol marker theory means it'll make it darker but just more saturated. Not necessarily a whole lot darker, but a bit more saturated, and you can see more shadow and prominence. After I add in the base shadows, I do some more basic clothing folds to get the idea that yes, this is a shirt. It has wrinkles and folds like any other. Next, I go in with the purple shadows because once again, you can never go wrong with purple shadows. Adding that to the blue, just mwah, it looks so good. Even though the shading is not the most logical or the highlights, it just looks so good. I love the combination of blue and purple shading. Next, I go in and add some more basic shadows, especially on the right side. Again, that's our light source. Shadow on the right, highlight on the left. After I am done with the clothing, I then go on to adding highlights, or edit highlights, aka adding my gel pen. I love using a gel pen for adding things like highlights to the eyes, outlines to certain areas of the clothing, face, hair, etc. Outlining things, text bubbles, anything really. I think it just adds a lot more contrast to your character. And yeah, it's essentially how I color with alcohol markers. Again, this is not a professional tutorial. I am self-taught, and I kind of just wanted to explain my process to those who are wondering. Thank you so much for watching. I will see you again in my next video, and bye-bye-bye! Woohoo! Yahoo! Let's go! Haha.